Okay, so we just saw this example of the do-while loop. Here, do-while loop. Now let's go back and discuss the details of do-while loops. So do loops. So a different type of loop structure is the do loop, also called do loop. This type of loop allows repeated execution of a set of statements, but with loop termination based on a conditional test. So you saw this conditional test. This is what he meant by the conditional test here. So it stops based on this test. Okay, not on the value of a built-in loop index. These can be used to execute a loop an indefinite number of times. So it doesn't say infinite number of times. It says indefinite, so not predetermined number of times. This is different than a for next loop, which once you put in the end in there, it's a given amount of cycles. Warning, for all types of do loops, we will need to declare a loop index by ourselves if we need one. So that's what he means by here. Remember, we had to declare the index here, whereas we didn't need to do that in the for loop. It's kind of already done as part of the for loop syntax. And also, if so, we must also increment it during each iteration by ourselves, and we shouldn't forget to do that. So that's here. Remember, we did that. We incremented. Here we defined the index, and here we incremented it. Okay, and we can't forget to increment it. If you left this out, what would happen? Like if n was equal to 5, what would happen? And you started out with I equals 1, it would never get bigger than 1, right? Because you'd never increment I. So you'd say, so you would never increase I and make it 2 or 3 or whatever. So what would happen? I would always be less than 5 every time you test this. So that would be called an infinite loop. We don't want that because it wouldn't stop. If you do get that, I think you can just do escape. I think it will stop the loop for you. Or maybe there's some other way to do it. But anyway, we don't want that. Okay, so if so, we must also increment it, increment the index, the loop index, during each iteration by ourselves. Okay, there are 4 kinds of do loops, actually, but we don't need to get too confused about that right yet. But anyway, let's just see what he says. There are 4 flavors of do loops. Each is made using one of 2 keywords. So we used while. You can also use until as a different keyword. And the difference is basically, let's say, what did we use so far? We used while, right? So let's look at the 2 examples of while. We had one. We had do, while, and then loop at the end, right? Let's just check that. So we had do, while, and then loop at the end, right? He also uses until here, but let's not get to that one yet. So do, while, and then loop at the end. So do, while, and then loop at the end. But you can also do this one. Do, loop, while at the end. Okay, and it's just basically the difference is so if you test at the end, that, let's see, if you test at the not until the end, then one more iteration will occur before you stop. So we'll see that in a minute, but actually that's the effect, that you'll get one extra iteration out of it before it stops. but we'll see that in a minute. And then again, you can also use until. So the word while and until have slightly different meaning. So depending on which one you use, you get a slightly different effect. So we'll see those shortly. Okay, the do-while loop. So the first one that we did. Keeps looping while a loop condition is true. So here's the picture, or the flow chart. So we check the loop condition. If it's true, then we continue, and then we end. Now suppose the loop condition wasn't while, but was until. So do until. So if the loop condition is true, then we would go this way. But anyway, we'll check that later. So do while loop keeps looping while a loop condition is true. Test the condition at the start of each loop. So the while gets checked at the beginning. Halts when this condition becomes false. Right? So over here we said 15, if the user put in 15, so when it gets to 16, when I becomes 16, it's going to stop. Now what would happen if a while was down here? So let's say I was equal to 14, then what would happen? So you'd get, this would happen, then I would get equal to 15, right? And then loop, and we check, is 15 less than or equal to n? And yes, so we would go back up, and now I would be equal to this, and now I would get equal to 16, and then we would stop. Okay? Actually, there's a slight difference there. I might have misspoken when I said what the difference is, but there is a slight difference. Let's see in a minute. Okay, so keyword while says test our condition. Test at the start of each loop. If the condition is true, the statements are executed once. For example, adding the numbers from 1 to 1,000 by declaring incrementing and cumulatively summing a block level variable called n. So block level variable, the scope is in the block. We could use the condition is n less than or equal to 1,000. Okay? Keyword loop then tells control to loop, or in other words, to return to do, and another cycle begins. Do until loop. Okay, do we want to look at this now? All right, let's check it. The do until loop. So if we did do until, then keeps looping while a loop condition is false. So in that case, we'd want to say do until n is greater than 1,000, right? When we said do while, we wanted to do while n was less than or equal to 1,000. But if we wrote until, we'd say do until n is greater than 1,000. Okay? So, in other words, it keeps looping while the loop condition is false, not while it's true. That's when we use until. Test the condition at the start of the cycle, because until, we're saying put until at the beginning of a cycle. Here's the statements to be run, and then the keyword loop. And halts after the cycle in which the condition becomes true. So when this condition becomes true, when n is 1,001, for example, it will stop. The VB syntax for the do until loop is do until condition statements loop. The keyword do says start the cycle. Keyword until says test our condition. Test it at the start. It's done at the beginning, not at the end, of each loop. If the condition is false, then you do it. Right? That's what until means. So do until this is greater than 1,000. So as long as it's false, we're going to do it. As soon as it's not false, we're going to stop. So test at the start of each loop. If the condition is false, the statements are executed. For our example, we would have n is greater than 1,000. the keyword loop then tells the control to loop or return to do. This tells us to go back, and another cycle begins. Okay, so this one, if it's true, it ends, whereas this one, if it's false, it ends, right? So they're different. Okay, then we have the while coming at the end. So let's see what happens then. The do loop while. So do loop while with the statements in here and the while condition down at the end. Keeps looping until a loop condition is true. Keeps looping while a loop condition is true. And tests the condition at the end of each cycle instead of at the beginning. Halts after the cycle in which the condition becomes false. So the other one halts before the cycle in which the condition becomes false, right? If we had the while up here, do while loop instead of do loop while. But the do loop while halts after the cycle in which the condition becomes false. The VB syntax is this. The keyword do says execute our statements once. Keywords loop while says test our condition. Test it at the bottom of each loop. If the condition is true, returns to the do and another cycle begins. Otherwise, the loop ends. So we could have this. N is less than or equal to 1,000. So I may have said that wrong. Actually, if we have the condition at the end, we still have the same condition here. It still goes through the same number of cycles. But let's check a little further. Okay, we also have the do loop until, but we'll skip that one for a moment. And let's take a look at this, and this. And this one we did. This is the for loop. And now here's the do while loop and do until loop. Okay, I'll let you check this one yourself. But again, we want to stop when n gets greater than, when I gets greater than n. Here we wrote, do it while I is less than or equal to n. Let's see, what does he say? Note, for both of these do loop types, the test for both of these do loop types is at the top, so here and here, but this one is while and this one is until. The difference is the use of logically opposite thinking, while versus until, which requires opposite test conditions to give the same result. Right? So we get opposite test conditions. Okay, now this is do loop while and do loop until. The test for both of these is at the bottom. So here we have I is less than or equal to n. It's actually the same test as before here. And here, I is greater than or equal to n is the same test as before here. Okay? So let's test it. So you can do this. You can build this program. Okay, next we'll talk about nested loops.